Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey has introduced millions of people to Homer's epic. It's a story of monsters, shipwrecks, and gods. But hidden amongst Odysseus' travels and travails are some of the oldest astronomical references in Western literature. Heraclitus even referred to Homer as the astronomer. Homer tells us which constellations Odysseus used to navigate, describes the structure of the universe as the Greeks imagined it, and may even preserve clues that some scholars have tried to use to date the Trojan War itself. But how much of this is genuine astronomy, and how much is modern readers finding patterns that Homer never intended? In this video, we'll separate the evidence from the speculation as we explore the astronomy hidden within the Odyssey to understand what Homer may have known about astronomy before the telescope. The first person that we know of to suggest the Earth was a sphere was Pythagoras, sometime in the 6th century BCE. However, Homer, writing around the 8th century BCE, imagined the world as flat, encircled by a world river, Oceanus. It was encapsulated by a dome he regularly described as starry, even during the day, perhaps indicating the understanding that the stars were not gone, but simply hidden by the glare of the sun. Homer doesn't treat this dome as an abstraction, but proposes it as solid, describing it as iron or brazen at various points in the Odyssey. The sun was presented as rising from Oceanus, continuing upwards until midday, and then setting again into the world-girding stream. It's not entirely clear how Homer imagined this process to happen. He tells us that Odysseus traveled to the Isle of Aea, where Eos the Dawn has her house and dancing floor, to the place where the sun rises. This seems something of a contradiction, as if it was a place that Odysseus could visit, it very well couldn't be in Oceanus. Rather, the phrase may not be intended to be taken literally and would have to be interpreted simply as a place far to the east. Similarly unclear is what Homer thought happened to the sun after it set. Was it extinguished before being generated anew the next day? Or did it travel beneath the earth? The latter is perhaps the preferred explanation, as Odysseus at one point remarks how far it is to where the light-giving sun rises or where he sinks below the earth. Several authors suspect that Homer also included references to the summer solstice. Odysseus notes that there's an island called Syri you may have heard of, beyond Ortygia, where the sun turns in its course. Many scholars have interpreted this as a solstice reference because Hesiod uses a very similar turn of phrase, referring to the turnings of the sun, which is explicitly tied to the solstices. However, it's not clear that this is what Homer meant, and as such, this reference is less than certain. As far as the starry dome, Homer makes reference to a few constellations as Odysseus leaves Calypso's island Vogiga. He writes, "Odysseus spread his sail to the wind with joy, and steered the raft cleverly with the oar as he sat there. At night he never closed his eyes in sleep, but watch the Pleiades, late-setting Bootes, and the great bear that men call the Wain, that circles in place facing Orion, and never bathes in the sea." These, Homer tells us, Odysseus was using for navigation as directed by Calypso, and was certainly what inspired the quip used in the film about keeping the bear on the right. This would have been an easy navigational aid because the Great Bear, Ursa Major, is circumpolar at those latitudes, never setting beneath the horizon. Furthermore, it's interesting to note that Homer describes the Great Bear as being the one that circles in place. If you're familiar with the night sky, you're probably thinking that it's Ursa Minor that is closer to the celestial pole. Did Homer make a mistake? If so, he certainly doubled down on it, as he notes that the bear in question faces Orion, making this unambiguously Ursa Major. The answer to this riddle is that 3,000 years ago, the celestial pole lay between these two constellations. Although still closer to Ursa Minor on the bowl end as opposed to the end of the handle, these two bears would both appear to wheel around this point, somewhat opposite it from one another. Also within the starry dome, the bright star Sirius is mentioned as a star that rises in the late summer. We also find a reference to the planet Venus when Homer states that the brightest of all stars began to show, the one that, more than any other star, comes to announce the light of dawn born in her earliness, indicating that he views Venus as the morning star. However, it doesn't make it clear that Homer understood this morning star to be the same object as the evening star. So while there are numerous clear references to astronomical objects and phenomena, the picture from Homer is still hazy. As the author D.R. Dix put it, the obvious phenomena of the heavens were well known, but simply as observed occurrences, with no hint that the reasons for them were understood or that any scientific explanation of them was envisaged. Indeed, Homer wasn't writing an astronomy textbook. His goal was storytelling. Still, the fact that he casually assumes his audience recognized these constellations tells us that knowledge of the night sky was already widespread, centuries before the classical Greek astronomy of Aristarchus, Eratosthenes, Hipparchus, and Ptolemy emerged. However, some astronomers think that Homer may have known more than he let on. In the lead-up to Odysseus' return, the prophet Theoclymenus had a vision in which he foresaw the killing of the suitors. He warns them, "All the forecourt is huddled with ghosts. The yard is full of them as they flock down to the underworld and the darkness. The sun has perished out of the sky, and a foul mist has come over." The latter portion of this, in which the sun has perished from the sky, has often been interpreted as a total solar eclipse. This is potentially reinforced by the fact that the text also mentions that the night that Odysseus kills the suitor was a new moon, given that only at this time can a solar eclipse occur. This led some to attempt to determine which eclipse this may have been referring to by examining the dates given by various authors for the Battle of Troy, and then looking for an eclipse that would have been visible from the Ionian Islands around 10 years later, the amount of time it reportedly took Odysseus to make that voyage home. Various authors give different dates. The earliest, given by the Greek historian Duras of Samos in the 3rd to 4th century BCE, is that of 1333 BCE. Another Greek historian, Herodotus, from the 5th century BCE, supposed it to be around 1250 BCE. Dicaearchus, a student of Aristotle from the 4th century BCE, estimated it to have occurred in 1212. The Parian Chronicles, author unknown, placed it in 1208. Plato, in the early 4th century BCE, gave it as 1193, whereas the 2nd century BCE philosopher Eratosthenes reported it occurred in 1184 BCE. The chronographer Solsibus of Laconia reckoned it to have occurred in 1172 BCE. And the historian Ephorus in the 4th century BCE guessed it to have been in 1135 BCE. So, as you can see, there's quite a few dates to choose from. However, being able to see a solar eclipse from a given location is quite rare. On average, a location will only see a total solar eclipse about once every 375 years. Thus, while the estimated range spans nearly 200 years, that doesn't even guarantee that Ithaca would have seen a single solar eclipse. And yet, it did, on the 16th of April, 1178 BCE. A paper from 2008, widely reported on at the time, claims to have added further evidence to this. Specifically, it looks at a handful of other astronomical events, some of which we've already mentioned. As Odysseus left from Ogygia, near sunset, the Pleiades, Bootes, and Ursa Major were all visible. The text tells us that this was 29 days before the battle against the suitors. When he met the Phaeacians, 5 days before the battle, Venus, described as the Star of Dawn, was visible. Since it was described this way, it indicates that Venus was above the horizon to the east in the morning. Lastly, the authors speculate that Hermes, who was sent by Zeus to order Calypso to release Odysseus, may have been a reference to Mercury. The text describes Hermes traveling west to Ogygia, before returning east to Olympia. The authors propose that this may have been a reference to Mercury undergoing retrograde motion as it reached its greatest elongation from the Sun. Not assuming any date, the authors used a brute force approach, considering every possible new moon in the proposed date range to see if there was an eclipse, and, if so, how many of these other astronomical references were fulfilled. And again, only one date fits, the 16th of April, 1178 BCE. However, the notion that there was an eclipse has not been met without some strong criticism. In particular, it has been pointed out that the passage in which Theoclymenus makes this prediction also indicates that they will flock down to the underworld, Erebos or Hades, which is a place that the sun does not shine and the sun god Apollo cannot see. If this is considered, the reference no longer needs to be interpreted as an eclipse, rendering the task of searching for one unnecessary. Additionally, Homer uses a similar turn of phrase in the Iliad, but is clearly being metaphorical. The connection of Hermes to Mercury also doesn't hold up. While Hermes was regularly connected to this planet centuries later, there's no evidence that this was being done in the century that Homer wrote. Rather, the earliest connection that scholars can point to comes from Plato's Timaeus, in which he states that Mercury is a star which is called sacred to Hermes. However, this was 2 to 3 centuries after Homer. Worse yet, if making the connections between the gods and the planets, one would expect this to be extended further, so we could look at how the other gods moved. Zeus, later associated with Jupiter, did not move at all from his seat on Olympus. There was also a point in which Ares, associated with Mars, met with Aphrodite, associated with Venus. Similarly, Apollo, the sun god, met with Zeus. Should these be interpreted as conjunctions? If such things are not assumed, then the connection between Hermes and Mercury should not be either. Lastly, the timeline that is built for the other astronomical events should also be questioned. Although the text does give explicit numbers of days between these events, these numbers are regularly reused. For example, the text states that after leaving Calypso's island, he traveled for 17 days, and on the 18th came to the land of the Phaeacians. This is exactly the same number of days that the Achaeans mourned the death of Achilles, 17 days, before burning his body on the 18th day. There's also many repetitions in Homer's works about something going on for 9 days to be followed by an event on the 10th day. As such, it's likely that this was poetic tradition or these numbers just scanned better. Indeed, the internal chronology of the Odyssey doesn't fit well. As such, I find the eclipse hypothesis an intriguing coincidence, but not one that can be taken too seriously. Another portion of the Odyssey that has been interpreted as an astronomical reference is a series of bird signs. At 3 points throughout the story, an eagle is seen clutching a bird of one sort or another, which is presented as a sign. In the first example, an eagle was reportedly seen holding a dove and heading west, which is interpreted as a bad omen for the suitors. In the second, the eagle is holding a goose and heading eastwards when Telemachus left for Sparta. Helen interprets this as a good sign. Lastly, the eagle in the east grasps a dove, and the eagle plucks its feathers mid-flight as Telemachus returns to Ithaca in the early morning, just before sunrise. This is interpreted by Theoclymenus as a positive sign. But what the authors of the paper exploring this set of omens question is how someone would have been able to see the faint falling feathers of the dove before sunrise. They suggest that this must have been something luminous, something astronomical. These authors also assume that Theoclymenus' prophecy was an eclipse, but they prefer a date for it of the 30th of October, 1207 BCE. Based on this, and again trusting the chronology given, they examined the orientation of the sky on the date that Telemachus would have returned to Ithaca, and noted that the constellation of Corvus was visible in the southeast, just before sunrise, vaguely matching the description of the eagle. They then interpret this constellation to be Homer's eagle, despite the traditional association being that of a crow. They also draw a connection to the dove being held, noting that the Greek word for dove, Peleia, is very similar to the Pleiades. In fact, many Greek authors referred to the Pleiades as the Pleiades, a flock of doves. Lastly, they claim that the falling feathers reported was actually a meteor shower with its radiant somewhere in Taurus. Overall, I find these claims far too fanciful to be taken seriously. Firstly, it should be noted that the eclipse that the authors in this paper preferred wasn't even a total solar eclipse. The sun was only obscured by 75%. While this would produce a noticeable drop in brightness, it is not the full disappearance from the sky that the text describes. Also, the association of Corvus to the eagle seems unlikely, as Corvus had been identified as a crow long before Homer, and was part of a narrative also involving the constellations of Hydra and Crater, in which Apollo sent Corvus to fetch the contents of the cup, Crater. However, Corvus delayed his return because he wanted to eat some nearby fruits which were not yet ripe. Thus, he waited. When he did return, the bird blamed the delay on a water snake, Hydra. Apollo saw through the lie and turned the silver bird black, thus creating an explanation for the black appearance of crows. He then threw all three into the heavens. As such, trying to reinterpret this constellation as an eagle with no other supporting evidence beyond it was vaguely in the east is a stretch. Although the relationship between the Pleiades and doves is interesting, the Pleiades are far across the sky from Corvus and thus not able to be held as described. In fact, the Pleiades were scarcely above the horizon just before dawn. Lastly, the meteor shower also lacks any supporting evidence. The authors note that late October is not too far from the Leonid meteor shower, which currently peaks in mid-November. While the Leonid stream itself certainly existed 3,000 years ago, as it is associated with the comet 55P Tempel-Tuttle, we have no evidence that the Earth encountered these same dense dust trails producing today's spectacular showers, as there's no other authors reporting meteor showers around that time of year. Furthermore, the authors even admit that due to precession, the radiant of the shower would have been in an entirely different portion of the sky, i.e. nowhere near Taurus or the Pleiades. Thus, they propose some other meteor shower, with utterly no supporting evidence, other than the assumption that this is an astronomical phenomenon and not poetic license or tradition. There's a few other tenuous astronomical connections that have also been considered. Odysseus' total journey from leaving Ithaca to his return is generally given as 19 to 20 years. Some astronomers have preferred the 19-year period because this would tie in with the 19-year Metonic cycle, in which the phases of the moon line up with the solar cycle. However, I haven't seen any stronger evidence than this being vaguely similar to the duration of Odysseus' journey. Meanwhile, other astronomers have preferred a 20-year journey, which would vaguely match the period between successive conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn. Similarly, authors have tried to connect the 12 stops along Odysseus' return voyage to the 12 signs of the zodiac. But perhaps surprisingly, I'm unaware of attempts to connect the 12 axe heads that Odysseus shoots through to the zodiac. Ultimately, whether or not Homer intended any of these astronomical puzzles, one thing is clear. The Odyssey preserves one of the earliest surviving views of the Greek sky. We find sailors navigating by familiar constellations, poets describing a cosmos bounded by Oceanus, and generations of readers inspired to search for meanings in the heavens. Some modern attempts to decode hidden eclipses and celestial messages probably ask more of the text than Homer ever intended, but they also remind us how carefully ancient people observed the sky, even before astronomy became a science. Homer wasn't an astronomer, at least not in the sense that we think of today, but he was clearly an observer of the world around him, a world that, in the next few centuries, philosophers would begin investigating further, asking not merely what appeared in the night sky, but why.